As Walter mentioned, after a little correction, this is an ebook only, and it's number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list for ebooks. And I take great satisfaction that a book about a budget wonk, a book by a budget wonk, I've done one myself, has managed to come in between number 8, The Bedwetter by Sarah Silverman, a humorous yet sometimes serious memoir from the comedian that was originally published in 2010, talk about legs, and just one notch about the book version of Argo. So you know that either one of two things, or possibly both, are true. One is people out there are really worried about the budget, or B, David did a great job. But David, let me start with that. So why did you do this book, and why is it an ebook? How did that come to be?
Yeah. First of all, let me just say thank you. Thank you to you for doing this. Thank you to Walter and Jim Spiegelman and all of you for coming out. So I can claim very little credit for the idea, or get very little blame for it.
You get all the blame.
The former editor of the New York Times Magazine is Jerry Marzorati, and he's been a really good editor for me, and he is now running the Times, a few different kind of new business parts of the Times, and one of them is ebooks. And he came to me with the classic promises of this won't be much work. He said, just take some of the things you did for the magazine and some columns you wrote, and it's part of this new venture the Times is doing. This is the second one. The first was that Snowfall about the avalanche. Right. But of course, it ended up being much more work than that because it's not that easy to take old stuff. But the idea was to do it really quickly in a time frame that wasn't at all possible to do with a printed book. And also, David and I both know Tyler Cowen. I've been in this room with Tyler Cowen. He's an economist who wrote a really successful ebook, Great Stagnation. And one of the things he argued is that there's something about that length that people really like. It's the length of old 18th century economic pamphlets. It's twice the length of a long magazine story. And it had sort of fallen away when publishing depended on print books.
And have you figured out how to autograph an ebook yet?
So a colleague of mine in New York tweeted a joke about how he can't get this autographed. So I printed a copy of the cover and signed it and sent it to him. So I have a stack of those in my office.
I keep asking this because I'm hoping that sooner or later I'll say that, and some 23-year-old kid in the back of the room says, well, actually, I have an app that I'm trying to sell to Apple, but it hasn't happened yet. All right, so David, it seems to me that there are two poles in this debate about the deficit right now. Paul Krugman took one poll today. He talked in his column about that fiscal fear-mongering has become a major industry inside the Beltway among those who are really looking for excuses to dismantle Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and that people whose careers, I think he probably meant maybe me and maybe you, who are invested in the deficit scold industry don't want to let evidence undermine their point of view. And the other poll is that we're just one bad day in the markets away from catastrophe.
Greece.
So, yes, the analogies to Greece, which never strike me as very apt, often come up. So I wonder how you think about those two polls and how you steer your journalism between them.
I think a huge portion of it depends on time frame, right? I think my colleague, a friend of David's, Jackie Combs, had a piece not yesterday, but a week ago Sunday in the Times, pointing out that when you combine all these various deficit deals they've done over the last couple of years, the Budget Control Act spending stuff, the end-of-year tax increases, the sequester, we're now at something extremely close to $4 trillion of deficit reduction over the next 10 years. That was the goal that all kinds of folks wanted us to get to, including Bowles and Simpson. If you look at the CBO projections on how much the deficit is supposed to fall in coming years, if you look at where the deficit is headed, I think that over the medium term, the Krugman camp has a better claim on the evidence. I don't think the deficit now, after what we've done, is a huge short-term risk. It's not that we couldn't suddenly become some kind of, have some sort of trouble borrowing, but there's no evidence that it's about to happen. Over the long term, though, I think the other camp probably has a better argument to make, because the fact is, when you go look out 20, 25 years, which, yes, is a long time in the future, but still we know certain things about demographics, it's clear that we have a government that we haven't been willing to pay for. And so I think it's important not simply to say, well, the truth lies somewhere in between of the two, but that depending what frame you look at, I think each side has a better argument. And in fairness, I should just say, it's not that everybody on each side denies the other half of it, right? There are certainly
some people on each side.
Yes.
But when you think about this stuff, I'm sure you found that there's a surprising number of things that people believe that simply aren't true?
Yes.
And I wondered, what are your favorites? What do you?
I mean, my favorite, I think, by far, is these various versions of, well, I'm not the problem, right? And so I think the cleanest one on that is the Medicare calculation.
Right.
And this comes from the guys at the folks at the Urban Institute, which basically show that each of us pays much less over our lifetime. Not each of us. On average, we pay much less over our lifetime in Medicare taxes than we will get back. Now, it is true if you spend your whole life working and then drop dead on your 65th birthday, you will have paid more Medicare taxes than you receive from it. But the point is the average. And so when you put that statistic out there, what I sometimes hear back is, oh, but that doesn't take into account inflation. Yes, it does, right? Oh, but that doesn't take into account the fact that you can invest that money over the year. Yes, it takes that into account. It takes all these things into account. That doesn't take premiums into account. Yes, it takes premiums into account. And so basically, the deficit exists because on average, each one of us is going to get more from the government than we give. That is the deficit. And I think instead, there's so much of a sense that no, the deficit is because we have a big military, or the deficit is because of corporate pork, or the deficit is because of foreign aid, or the deficit is because of moochers, right? I'm not saying that some of these other things don't play a role, but at root, the deficit is us.
You say in the book that you think Republicans have won the debate on taxes, but that Democrats have won the debate on spending. What do you mean by that?
So it flows from that, which is that we have voted ourselves a larger government than we want to pay for in the long term, and that although there are nuances around this, Republicans have largely won the fight over what portion of our economy should be taxes, and although there are nuances, Democrats have largely won the fight over what our spending should look like, Medicare and Social Security above all. And the problem is those two numbers don't match. I remember a few years ago I had a really interesting conversation with Mitch Daniels. It's one of these journalistic rituals, which will start again when you try to game out who's going to be running for president in a few years, and you go and you interview them when they're actually still willing to talk to journalists. And so I went out to Indianapolis.
Or at least talk the truth to journalists.
Yes. And spent a long time in then Governor Daniels' office, which is a gorgeous old office in downtown Indianapolis. And we got to this nice point in the conversation. He's obviously a really small government conservative. He hinges on libertarian in some ways. And he said, look, we can have a debate about how big government should be, right? And who knows where it ends up. It may not end up where I want. That's him talking about. But the one place where it needs to end up is that the tax part and the spending part need to line up. They don't have to be equal. We can run a deficit, which is a wonky subject we can get into if you want. But they have to line up. And right now, they're not lining up. We have a bigger government than we're willing to pay for, and we can't simply get rid of it through waste, fraud, and abuse.
And do you think the Republicans and Democrats are internally consistent on that question or not?
Tell me what you mean.
Well, Republicans are for small government in terms of taxes. Do you think they're being open about what that government means in terms of spending? And Democrats are for generally bigger government. Do you think they're open about what that means in the form of taxes?
No. So, and I think the tensions are different between the two parties. I think the tension within the Republican Party that's so interesting right now is the Republican Party is a very old party in terms of who votes for it. And there's this cliche that the young are liberal and the old are conservative. And it's not true most of the time. But it is true now, which is a really funny thing, right? If you go back and look at exit polls from the elections in the 1980s, George H.W. Bush, who no one would think of as sort of a kind of hip, new age, edgy guy, won the youth vote, right? He won the youth vote. Because basically, if you won the youth vote, and you won the middle-aged vote, and you won the old vote. That's the way through the 1970s and 80s and 90s America voted. There weren't big age gaps, but there are now. Mitt Romney won a landslide among the over 65 population. And so for the Republicans, that's this real tension. And I think one of the ways you saw it was, remember when Obama in his inaugural address took dead on this Paul Ryan notion of takers? And then Paul Ryan came out and said, oh, well, I don't mean Medicare and Social Security. Those aren't takers. And I think one of the things that those statistics on Medicare point out is, yes, they are takers in sort of a budgetary standpoint. We are takers. And so I think part of the reason you see Republicans having a hard time finding a grand bargain that they actually want is coming out in favor of Social Security cuts and Medicare cuts is really hard for a party that relies on Social Security beneficiaries and Medicare beneficiaries. On the Democratic side...
Even though a lot of them would not be touched, the people who are already collecting.
Yes, even though a lot of them would not be touched, right? Ryan's plan, for example, says if you're over 55. On the Democratic side, I think the tension is that there is a real concern about a middle class and lower income living standards. Whereas as I love Obama's formulation for poor people. He doesn't say poor, he says middle class and people who hope one day to be middle class, right?
There's a reason he got elected.
Yes, there is a real concern, and it's a legitimate concern about how tough those people have had it now for the last decade. And I think that's why you see Obama saying no tax increases for anybody for the bottom 98% of the population. But it's really hard to see how we have the kind of government that people say they want without raising taxes on the bottom 98%, given how historically low they are right now.
Right. Now, in any book about the budget on spending, it's hard to avoid circling in and hitting healthcare. That's the big driver and stuff. How do you think about the healthcare thing, and what do you think about the recent indications that the pace of healthcare spending growth has slowed down? Do you think that's a harbinger of things to come, or a blip that we shouldn't count on, or
I think
neither?
I think it's deeply encouraging, deeply encouraging. So healthcare is really the lion's share of our deficit. And one way to think about our healthcare problem is, if you look at how much our government, all told, federal, state, local, spends on healthcare per person, so this is dollars, it is very similar to the amount that governments spend in other rich countries. Slightly lower, but not much lower. We then double that spending by spending the same amount from the private sector, right? And so healthcare is a huge part of the problem. It has consistently been growing faster than anything else, faster than incomes, faster than GDP, much faster than inflation. And in the last few years, it's really slowed down. There's some reason to think that it might be temporary, as your question suggests. When there's a recession, people buy less of everything. They buy less healthcare too. But I think the evidence is stronger, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on which parts of this you agree with, that it is not just temporary. And I crib here from my colleague Annie Lowry, who's pointed out that the reasons to think that it's not just temporary are, one, you see the slowdown in Medicare, where you would think there should be less sensitivity to the economy because it's often covered, and you see the slowdown even in states that have been less hard hit by the economic downturn. So to me, that's a sign that healthcare spending may in fact be slowing, that all these things, the private sector, doctors, insurance companies, and the public sector, some of the early stuff in Obamacare, is having an initial effect, and it is one of the reasons why I don't think we should be totally despondent about the state of the deficit.
Great. Reporter says we shouldn't be totally despondent. That passes for real optimism among the budget. Do you think that the Affordable Care Act, not so much its provisions, which many of which haven't taken effect yet, but the kind of gestalt is having an effect?
On spending, you mean?
Yeah.
I do, but I think to be a fake academic for a minute, which is one of my favorite things to be, I think the correlation is a little bit spurious. So I think that there is this huge movement, sort of ill-defined movement that is trying to reduce the growth of healthcare costs. It includes doctors. I wrote a big profile in the Times Magazine about one of them named Brent James out in Salt Lake City a few years ago. It includes insurance companies. It includes some government officials. It includes various people. And I think that movement had a big effect on some of the lesser-known provisions in Obamacare. People like Zeke Emanuel were involved in that. I think then Obamacare is having an effect on some of the slowdown, but I think that I think the things driving that slowdown predated Obamacare, and Obamacare fed into it rather than being the sort of birth of that real.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that though the healthcare industry, the insurers in particular, can look ahead a little bit and see that it's going to be a rough few years. So if you're going to try and do something that really changes the way health care is delivered, you're more likely to do it now that you know we're going to be stuck with Obamacare than you might have been before Obamacare, or if you thought it was going to be repealed.
Right.
But, yeah.
And it's sort of remarkable when you think about the 9 lives aspect of Obamacare. It's sort of remarkable. I mean, think about the things it had to survive. It had to survive Senator Byrd almost dying before it was passed, which at the time no one was focused on, but given how soon he passed away after it passed, is really sort of remarkable. It had to survive Scott Brown's election. It had to survive all these little things. And then it passed, which was sort of a death-defying act of legislative bargaining. And then it had to survive the Supreme Court, and it had to survive Obama's reelection, and now it looks like it's actually here to stay.
Right. When you think about spending, is there anything else that you think that gets less attention than it should?
I think that let's set aside for a minute the debate over how big government should be. It's a vital debate. I'm not suggesting it's less important than what I'm about to say. It matters hugely. Let's just set it aside for a minute. And let's say at a given level of spending for our economy, I think there's a frame that doesn't get enough attention, which is how much do we spend on the future versus how much we spend on the present? How much do we spend on investment versus how much we spend on consumption? And to put a frame on it that a number of smart, thoughtful liberals I know really don't like, and I've had a few of them yell at me about this, put the frame of how much we spend on elderly adults versus how much we spend on children. By any one of those measures, we spend a lot on the now, on the older, on the consumption, and relatively little on the future, on the younger, on the investment. Julia Isaacs has done these calculations showing that we spend about 2.5 times the amount per person on people over 65 than we do on people under 20. Other countries in the world that look a little bit like us, the English-speaking countries, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, England, they're all closer to 1.5. And you look at the sequester, right? The sequester completely spared, well, almost completely spared Medicare, did completely spare Social Security. We focused our cuts on the portion of the government that applies much more to the young than the old. And I think wherever you think we should be on that, I think that's a part of the debate that we don't have enough.
I want the record to show that we managed to get 20 minutes into this conversation before we used the word sequester, which was one of my goals. But since you brought it up, do you think anything good is going to come out of this confrontation or not?
I think that, I think there are a few good things that could come out of it. I'm not suggesting it's mostly good. It's a pretty bad way to budget, the extent to which it's indiscriminate. I think you can argue that from a standpoint of policy, it would be better if we flipped it and said, there are no cuts to everything in the sequester, and there are cuts to everything outside of the sequester. I think you could argue that would actually be better. You could even, if you want, put taxes in there and say there are no cuts to anything involved in the sequester. There are automatic cuts to Medicare, Social Security, and there are automatic tax increases. So, having said that, what are the positive sides of it? I think there's been a change in the debate over military spending. I think we went through this period where you couldn't really debate any serious cuts to military spending, and we now see on both the left and the right serious grappling with the huge run-up in the military budget over the last decade. Chuck Hagel actually is a really nice example of that. A few months ago, we would have given him as an example of someone on the right who's questioning military spending. You probably put him on the left because he works for Obama, so put Rand Paul on the right. Obama proposed relatively modest budget cuts to the military. The sequester not only are those going to happen, but the sequester takes them much further. So I think the military, in a way that Medicare and Social Security aren't yet, I think the military is now part of the budget cutting conversation in a way that it really should be. I don't know whether these cuts are right, but it shouldn't be excluded from it. And then the other thing I'd say is, I think there's waste in government. I think a lot of government programs spend more than they need to. And I think having some sort of automatic measure in which a bunch of government agencies have to figure out, wait a second, can we survive on less? This isn't the right way to do it, but you were asking for silver linings, and I think that's a silver lining.
And do you think it will produce the kind of outcome that you and I think ought to be, a kind of more smarter attempt at deficit reduction, or do you think it'll be another Band-Aid that buys them to the end of this fiscal year, and then we can go through this again next year.
As one of Nate Silver's colleagues, I guess I like percentages. So
it's okay, but you can't say 50-50.
No, I won't. I think the odds are, it reminds me of the 40% rule. I forget who came up with this. I've heard Justin Wolfers do it, but you should always say there's a 40% chance of something unlikely happening, because if it happens, you sort of look smart because you are higher than most people, but if it doesn't happen, you can say, well, I said it wasn't going to happen.
That's supposed to give these tricks away. Really bad.
So I would put the odds of some kind of big deal that includes more tax revenue, cuts to Medicare and Social Security, the grand bargain, right, at, 40%, at I don't know, at 25%, at 30%, it's not out of the question,
right.
But I definitely think it's less likely than not. And then I think the thing that is also less likely than not is no change at all to the sequester. And I think the most likely thing is something where they tinker around the edges of the sequester, but that effectively the sequester, if you were going to look at it, you would say it more went into effect than it didn't. Mm-hmm. What's your
I think I agree with
crystal ball?
I think the question is, the only thing I would add to that is whether the sequester has driven attention to the point you made earlier about if you limit your spending cuts to the annually appropriated spending, some of it's defense, but some of it is stuff that people actually think is a good idea.
Right.
And I don't mean, what day does Yellowstone open? I mean the investments in the future.
Right.
So the question is whether that has kind of made people realize that there's a trade-off there. If you protect Social Security and Medicare and farm price supports and the military, TRICARE, and veterans, and you say they're off the table, then you're necessarily putting more pressure on these other things. And the sequester has, I think, inadvertently highlighted that.
Yes. Well, the Republicans have this problem, right, which is that they want to be against tax increases, but it really puts them in a bad spot in terms of being for cuts, right? But the thing that's taking precedence over that now is they can't seem to fold to Obama again.
Right.
So I think one of the things to watch for here is, can we get far enough away from the sequester that partially undoing the sequester doesn't look like it's partially undoing the sequester.
Right.
And Republicans can feel like we won that sequester fight.
Right.
And now we're kind of moving on to something else.
Right, I agree with that. In the book, when you open the chapter on revenues, you have an interesting sentence, which I'm sure you wrote deliberately. And the sentence is, after Medicare, Social Security, and the military, the final big pot of money available for deficit reduction is the income that the federal government is not currently collecting in taxes. What the hell does that mean?
So you're right, that was deliberately provocative. It's one of those sentences that I realize it's the way people who are in favor of low taxes, think the mainstream media must think, right? That income is just, the government's just letting us keep it.
Right.
What I was trying to highlight is that by any measure, taxes are near a historic low right now. We went back at the Times and built this whole database to look at taxes over the last 30 years, and we found that at essentially every income point along the spectrum, people are paying lower taxes today, all told, federal, state, local, than they would have with the same income 30 years ago. We've basically all gotten a tax cut. And that's part of the reason why tax revenue the last couple of years has been, the lowest level since the early 50s, mid-50s? I don't know. But it's the lowest level in more than 50 years as a share of the economy. And so as we're thinking about what are the deficit solutions, it's clear to me that one of the most obvious, whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, one of the ones that has to be at the top of the list is what has changed. What has changed is that we collect less in taxes than we used to as a share of our economy. None of us feel that way. We all don't like tax.
Apart from this dip from the recession.
Apart from this, well, the recession is what really takes you down to the 60-year low. Right. And we're coming up from it, right, because Obama raised taxes. But just think of it, George W. Bush gave all of us a really big tax cut. The Democrats focused more attention on the part of that at the very top, and it was the biggest. But he gave us all a big tax cut. And so if you're looking at this long-term deficit, if you're looking at an aging society with really expensive health care, you can't pay for that with a historically low tax collection. And that needs to be part of the conversation, because either that requires fundamentally remaking government, or it requires higher taxes.
At the end of your book, you quite appropriately say that this really isn't about spending and taxes. It's about economic growth and the best way to get the economy growing more rapidly. And you note that it's become a cliche to say that today's kids will live less well than their parents. Then you say, I'm not sure this is a terribly comforting sentence, you say, but that's probably wrong. Right? So what are you talking about there? What do you side with the people who think that we really are screwed and that our kids will live less well than we do? Or do you side with the people who think that's kind of a narcissistic way of looking at the world, that the future is never as bad as the pessimists say it is, or what?
Yeah, I'm in the anti-we're screwed camp, I think. So first of all, let me just take a minute and do the nostalgia to puncture what I think is a little bit too much nostalgia. I talk about how great the growth rates were in the 1950s and 60s, right? So the growth rates were great in the 1950s and 60s. But let's not take, and we're not going to get back to them, but let's not take that too far and say, boy, if only we lived back in the 1950s or 60s. We were poorer in the 1950s and 60s, we lived less long, and we were less healthy. And to put an even finer point on it, unless you are a white male Protestant, which I'm not, and I'm guessing most people in this room aren't, and most people in the country certainly aren't, there is no argument that life was better in the 1950s and 60s than it is today. A white straight male Protestant, right?
They were all straight then.
Yes, exactly. So let's set that aside and realize that we have made progress, that life is better, right? And we can dig into some of the, if you doubt that, I'm happy to dig more into that in the Q&A. And then say, well, is that going to continue? Well, for hundreds of years now, life has been getting generally better. We are in the midst of this 12-year period, which is the longest stretch we've had in a really long time in which material living standards haven't risen. And so I think it's fair to have some skepticism about that now. And it's fair to say, well, maybe something really has changed and we're not anymore on the up escalator. But I think that's the less likely of the two cases. And I think the more likely of the two cases is that we're in this tough period now. And yes, growth rates and improvement in living standards may have fallen. And yes, we need to do some things to lift living standards. We can't keep cutting education funding at the states in order to pay for more health care, which is what we've been doing. If we do that, life may not be better in the future. But I think it's clear to me that I think the odds are higher that life will be better, and we certainly have it within our power. And I think one way to think about that is there any country in the world whose set of problems we'd rather have than our problems? I don't think so.
Let me ask you one final question about how you deal with all this as a journalist. We all have been struggling to deal with the fact that one side says one thing, another side says the other thing. We have a responsibility as journalists to tell people what is being said, but we also have a responsibility as journalists to avoid this false equivalence. We don't say in the paper that, to be sure, some people think the earth is flat, or that we don't require our reporters to go talk to Hitler's mother to say, well, he was actually a nice guy.
Right.
So how do you deal with that when you deal with something as contentious as the budget that involves so many facts but also so many choices, political choices?
So speaking of progress, I think this is an area in which the media's made progress, and I still think we have some problems with it. But if you look at how the media has changed, when did your column begin?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. If you look at how the media has changed, even in this realm, over the last 10 or 15 years, I think we've seen some real progress. First of all of this is a little bit small bore, but I'll move on from it. All of the kind of major print publications have started a version of the column that David writes, right? And his has been a model for a lot of ours. So the Journal has David. The Times used to have me and now has Eduardo Porter. The New Yorker has Jim Surowiecki, right? The Washington Post had Steve Pearlstein and now has Ezra Klein and his colleagues. You sort of look all over. We've had a flowering of blogs on both the right and the left. There are many more places you can go for analysis that isn't simply so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that, but that actually, in part of their job, is to give you the underlying information, right? To give you, hey, you know what, here are the facts on what's going on. And I think that's been, part of it is related to the development of blogs, but I think the media does a better job than it used to. I think in some ways some of this budget stuff is an easier place to do it than some of the other areas because we have numbers, right? We can say things like the average person gets more in Medicare than they put in, right? We can say that taxes as a share of our economy are lower than they have been for most of the last 60 years. We can say that in percentage terms, high-income people have gotten by far the biggest tax cut over the last 30 years. Those are facts. Now, there are other facts you can line up and say they point in other directions. Those facts deliberately point in different directions. But I think this is a really important thing for the media to engage with and to acknowledge that there is no perfect answer, right? We can't simply say, well, we deal only in objective, undisputed truth, and we don't go in that other stuff. Things aren't just 100 to 0, like 2 + 2 = 4, where the Earth rotates the sun, or 50-50, in which one side says one thing and one side says the other. There are a vast area of topics where each side are saying different things, but depending on the thing you're talking about, they don't have equal claim on what the evidence is. And to expand it even beyond the budget, I think the thing that proves that you can't simply absent yourselves from this debate is if you were once writing about the American economy, you would have wanted to quote people who say, you know what, businesses really shouldn't hire Jews, or they shouldn't hire Irish people. That wasn't a crazy view relative to the current debate. I don't think we would now ever quote someone who said businesses shouldn't hire Jews. I'm pretty sure about that. There are debates we're having now that may one day look as anachronistic as that debate, and we do feel this need to quote people from both sides. But we have to try to make some judgments and some decisions about which one of these debates are kind of legitimate areas for democratic disagreement, and which one of these debates are sort of disconnected from the facts. We have to kind of get into that arena and sort of get dirty in making those decisions.
I think I agree with you in principle. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you are about how far we've come. But we have microphones here. Please use them because we're recording this. And please remember that the convention is that a question ends with a question mark. Let's start over here. You want to call it or do you want me to do it?
No, you do it, please.
I have two related questions. I gather when Social Security went in, it was designed so people would basically pay for themselves, the average person. Why was that not done when Medicare went in? I may be wrong in my premise. And secondly, if we were to try to close that gap on Medicare, which I think is like 3 to 1, how is that done today? How would we get more money to pay for Medicare from the recipients? Thank you.
I don't know the history on this, so I can't answer that definitively, but I am confident that the most important reason is that healthcare was so much less expensive when LBJ signed Medicare than it is today. So the idea, and people lived shorter, right? So the idea of promising people 1960s style healthcare, which wasn't as good, but also had less waste, when people lived shorter, there was less of a disconnect back then. The answer is we have to make changes. But we've done that with Social Security, right? I mean, that's what the Greenspan Commission did in the 80s. That's what we'll have to do again on Social Security, because once you get 20 years out, it doesn't cover its costs. And so you do things like some of the kinds of things that are in Obamacare, where you say we're not going to pay for things. It has very small stuff on this, but you could do more of it. We're not going to pay for things if there isn't evidence that it actually makes a difference, right? We're going to give you bonuses if you're doing high-quality, low-cost healthcare. So my guess is on the Medicare side, most of the action has to happen on the spending side, but then you could also increase the taxes as well.
That's what I was after. How would you increase Medicare? What's the easiest way to increase the Medicare?
Well, when you think about how much inequality has risen, right, there is a large portion of Medicare taxes that have not historically touched any income at the top, and there's much more income at the top now. Now, Obamacare starts to change that and actually goes after some of that income at the top. And Obamacare is really a tax on rich people to give health care to sick and poor people. But you could change the rate. I mean, you could do it any number of ways. You could change the rate. You could change the amount of upper income that's eligible, that's subject to it. You could also get rid of some of the tax deductibility.
Right, but two things about that. One is, Social Security changed a lot from the day when FDR brought it in. And two big things changed. One is it didn't cover nearly so many people when it was conceived. So for instance, if you were a farm worker, you weren't paying in, or you were a domestic, you weren't paying in, and you didn't get covered, it's only later that Social Security expands so that it becomes a way for low-income people to get more than they put in. So these programs evolve. And of course, Social Security, the taxes are capped now at 100 and odd thousand, whereas on Medicare, we've let the tax rise, all your income is covered by Medicare. So there are ways you can play with the premiums of the taxes to get people to pay more of the share, upper income people. But I think as David correctly points out, we can't do Medicare on taxes alone. It just won't work. It has to be some way to slow the growth of spending. I think there was a woman there, and then Anders, did you have a question? Or the man next to you? Okay, so we'll just, start there, and then we'll go one row back at a time.
Katja von Schuttenbach. There was a recently published study that about 50% of the population in Germany will have some type of dementia by the time they reach retirement.
Is that an increase or decrease?
He's German. I should add that. David is German.
So I have not heard, and that's the remaining years of the baby boomer generation that they're talking about that here. Have you heard similar statistics for the United States? And that, of course, with the difficulty of obtaining long-term care insurance, and with the prevalence of DNA testing and people being excluded because they might have genetic traits to predispose them for Alzheimer's and dementia. How do you see that impact Medicare?
I haven't seen similar statistics, but I think there are two important points in there. One is, one of the reasons why our historic health care system in this country, in which we leave a lot of people uninsured, would become increasingly problematic over time, is science, right? It is going to become easier to figure out who's going to get sick, which essentially undercuts the whole notion of insurance if you don't make it possible for everyone to become insured. The second question in there about long-term care, I think one of the problems we have now with our health care for the elderly is how much we steer people toward some of the most expensive forms of it, right? We saw some of this debate over death panels. And so I think one of the things that's going to be important in reforming spending is finding ways to give people really clear choices in which you lay out the benefits and the downsides of different forms of care. The research seems to suggest that in most areas of medicine, when people are given a lot of information about their choices, or even a modest amount of information, on average, they make less costly choices than when doctors are effectively steering them toward different choices. And that sort of home care and kinds of care for Alzheimer's is, I think, an example of that.
I think there's a question right behind you, and then we'll start with the woman in purple, then we'll go back to the man behind her.
Hi, I have a perhaps unfair question, which is, what do we do about it? So I find it oddly comforting in a way that you're saying that it's human nature. The deficit is us. It's sort of the way that we all are. We want our cake and we want to eat it too. But at the same time, people talk about things like institutions that could perhaps fix the problem. But I think the sequester kind of gives the lie to that argument that we can erect all kinds of institutions, then we find ways around them. So do you see a sort of grand solution out there in terms of the deficit as a problem beyond healthcare and some of the sort of adjustment at the margin you just talked about?
I don't think there's ever going to be some sort of grand bargain that fixes it. I don't think they're going to emerge from a room and then we're all going to say, that's mostly solved, right? I think it's going to be 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or we hope not 3 steps forward and 4 steps back. But I think there are some little reasons for optimism, and they're important because they would help tell us how we're actually going to solve this if we're going to solve it, right? So we talked about healthcare and the slowdown in health costs. That is a really, really important thing. If that continues, if we can kind of push that even further, we will have much less of a deficit problem over the next 30 or 40 years than the CBO is currently projecting. I think there's been a sort of subtle shift in the tax debate. Now, I'm obviously pretty critical of the typical American voter, as you pointed out, of wanting more than he or she is willing to pay, and I think we deserve as much blame as some of the politicians. But the debate has changed a little bit. I mean, we just had an election in which one candidate promised higher taxes on the affluent, and the other went out of his way to make clear that he wasn't promising everyone a tax cut. Think about how much that's changed since the 1980s, when Democrats were terrified of being in favor of tax increases on the affluent because they thought it would expose them to being against anything good for the economy. And Republicans in every election promise lower taxes for all of you. So I think there's some sort of recognition. So I think it happens through a series of it's a modest fix to Social Security, like the kind David was talking about in the past. It's more serious stuff on this healthcare stuff. It's some kind of tax deal that eventually probably reduces some of the tax breaks we have. Maybe, and I'm not rooting for this, it's a natural disaster that makes Katrina or Sandy look small, and the politics around a carbon tax totally changes. So I think it's some combination of things.
Gentleman in the back who's been very patient behind her. You just passed. Oh. We'll move over here next.
Hi, it's Bob Kaiser. I think you just undermined the point that you made earlier that I want to challenge you about, which is the notion that the tax debate has been settled or that the Republicans have won it. I don't think we've had a tax debate in this country. I don't think the country understands taxes, and I'd like to know your view. Do you think the public has any sense what the percentage of GDP is that's paid in taxes now versus when Bill Clinton left office, for example? Isn't our political culture, including Congress, really profoundly obtuse about taxation in general? Isn't there a growth industry here, potentially, for starting to be sensible and direct and honest about taxes?
Since I used to work for Bob, I have to agree with him, but I would anyway. No, I agree. I did. That's true. Republicans, you've highlighted an internal contradiction. Republicans have won the debate on taxes so far. The place we've gotten to, I think the reason we have such a historically low tax base is because Republicans have been more successful in that political debate than Democrats. But I don't think that's necessarily going to last forever. And I think people don't know a lot about their taxes. I certainly don't think they know that much about the percentage of GDP. And I think most people would say, oh my goodness, my taxes are so much higher than they would have been 30 years ago. And that's just factually wrong. So I agree.
Do you want to come down here? We'll start there and then we'll move to you, Maria, afterwards.
You've alluded this afternoon to changes in Social Security. And I was just wondering if you have any projections on when, like, the age for Social Security might rise, or, anything more definite than just what I sort of hear.
So the age for Social Security has already risen, right? As I'm sure many people know, as part of the changes David was talking about. What is it for full benefits? Is it 67 now?
Or it's on its way to 67. It's not there yet.
Okay. Social Security is fine without any changes. It can continue paying out benefits until about 2033, right? That's a projection. It could be wrong. It could be 2028. It could be 2038. But at some point, we're going to have to do one of three things: raise Social Security taxes, cut Social Security benefits, or take resources from other programs and apply them to Social Security to pay our current benefits. And yes, that is taking into account the surplus that Social Security has been running over the years. That's giving it the benefit of that. So, I mean, my guess would be if you get a grand bargain, it could be this year, right? Obama has made it clear that he has no problem with changing the way the inflation is calculated. That would, do you know how long that would extend it? But I mean, that would be, my guess is, if the kind of fix we need, long-term fix for Social Security, my guess is the kind of thing Obama has already said he'd be willing to do is on the order of a third or a half of the problem. It's a lot of the problem. So the kind of changes we need to Social Security are much more modest. They're not nothing, but they're much more modest than what we need on Medicare. And we have a little bit of time to do them. It is not urgent.
Murray?
Finley Lewis of Congressional Quarterly. Following up on Bob's question, imagine for a moment that you're the chief economist for the Joint Tax Committee, and there is going to be some kind of negotiation that's going to touch on taxes and on spending. If you were to design a going-in proposal on taxes, that is something that would fundamentally look at the tax structure and consider all possible options, what would your advice be? What would your white start out by saying?
Meaning, what are the
words,
sort of most appealing options for redoing?
I mean, I sort of leaving politics aside, but you're going to recommend a fundamental redesign of the tax system in order to optimize the take to the government, and to encourage growth. What would that look like?
I think the first problem is simply that it doesn't collect enough revenue, right? Now, maybe we have a democratic debate and we decide we don't actually want Medicare and Social Security the way they are, although every indication to me is that we do, right? So I think the number one problem is it doesn't collect enough revenue for the kind of government Americans have said they want. That's the first problem. Barring big changes to other programs that at this point don't seem to be acceptable to the public, it doesn't collect enough revenue. And then the second, I think, is I don't think the second is the complexity, although it gets attention. I think it's we tax behavior that we actually want to encourage, and we don't tax behavior that we want to discourage. So it's how it treats things like savings versus income. It's the fact that we don't tax carbon at all. I mean, I've mentioned global warming a couple times deliberately, right? The deficit and global warming are both long-term threats to our economy and our country. It's sort of odd that we pay so much more attention to one than the other, and it seems to me that in any deficit debate, we want to continually come back to the climate change issue. And then I think the third one would be complexity. So then what you want is some series of things that collect a little bit more revenue, not a vast amount, shift things a little bit more so we're not taxing work quite so much, we're not taxing savings quite so much, that we're taxing particularly carbon-heavy consumption a little bit more. And then something that even in all that makes it a little bit less complicated. How would you edit that list of options?
That's a good list. I mean, the only question I'd ask you is how much do you think we should use the tax code to lean against the widening of inequality that we're seeing?
Yeah. Nope, that's a really good point as well, because no matter how much we improve education, which I think is by far the best inequality fighting tool, the reality of this kind of globalized economy we're living in is that inequality is going to be a lot wider than it used to be.
Let's see, there are two here, one right.
Thank you. Ken Lieberthal at the Brookings Institution. Two quick questions. One on effectively a carbon tax, which is what I take it you're in favor of. You mentioned earlier, if we had a sufficiently large natural catastrophe, that might change the politics sufficiently.
Real optimism.
Yeah. I was going to say, is that a necessary condition, or can you see any other path by which we actually might get there? Second question, though, and actually a more detailed one, is you started off saying that timing is everything, and the Democrats, on balance, have the weight of evidence on their side. I think that's 10 to 20-year projection. Republicans, if you go out beyond that. Part of the, say, Krugman argument is if you adopt the Republican approach to take care of the long term now, you in fact make us much less able to take care of that long term because it will damage economic growth between now and then in a significant way. So I guess my question is, how do you factor in that side of the argument? Where would you come out?
I think that's a really important point, and I probably should have emphasized it a little bit more, which is historically, the single best strategy for reducing a deficit is economic growth, right? It's not tax increases, it's not spending cuts, it's economic growth. In the wake of World War II, when we had substantially larger deficits than we've had recently as a share of the economy, we didn't have some big Bull-Simpson commission, right? We had really fast economic growth. And even if we're not going to get back to the 4% growth of the late 40s and 50s and 60s, and we're not, in all likelihood, even modest differences in growth can have a big effect on the deficit because of the power of compounding, right? And so what you really want to make sure you're not doing is damaging economic growth when you're putting in place these tax increases and spending cuts, because you will undermine yourself, as your question suggests. And as David indicated earlier, a lot of the cuts in the sequester seem as if they have the potential to undermine economic growth. They're the kinds of things, remember that our biomedical industry essentially started with NIH funding, right? The Pentagon built the internet. The jet engine, radar, penicillin, you name it, all these things started with a crucial government investment. Those are the kinds of things we're cutting, right? However good you think Medicare and Social Security are, they don't have that ability, and we're sparing them. On the carbon tax, I don't think a natural disaster is the only path to get there. There's this interesting theory that one way to get there is if you get a grand bargain that sets some amount of revenue that the government agrees to collect and doesn't specify how, that the politics then around a carbon tax could change. We then wouldn't be talking about whether to tax carbon. we'd be talking about how to implement $30 billion a year in new taxes, and that might actually make a kind of carbon tax a little bit more politically palatable.
Ken, I think there's a different way to frame the Krugman argument, or the people who agree with Krugman but worry that he doesn't worry enough about the long term. It's very easy to make the case that doing a lot of aggressive deficit reduction when you have 7.7% unemployment is not very smart. And that the notion that austerity will bring you growth seems to be not very well supported by the evidence, most recently in the UK. But I think that there are progressives who are sympathetic to Krugman on that, who say, yes, but if this is a long-term problem, and if it involves, as David points out in his book, doing something about restraining the growth and benefits to the elderly, particularly upper-income elderly, we ought to really do it now. When I came to Washington, the notion was we didn't have to do anything about the baby boom's retirement because we had a long time to get ready for it. Well, that was 1987. I mean, I'm so old that I'm going to benefit from Paul Ryan's promise not to touch my Social Security or Medicare. So that where I think that if you say, I don't know, Bob Rubin or some of the people involved in the Hamilton Project who are not Republican opponents of Paul Krugman, they would say that he doesn't understand or weight enough the importance of doing something today that would reduce deficits in the future. Because if we don't do it now, we might find ourselves 5 years from now with a much harder task. And that's where I think Paul correctly worries a lot about today's economy, but isn't really confident that our government could do anything now that would help in the future.
And there's another level. I mean, you hinted at it, but there's even another version of that, which is by opposing any changes now, right? You're not simply taking a standpoint about the size of government, which is the traditional debate. You're saying, hey, you know what? Younger people have to take a bigger share of the cuts. Right.
And then there's another tactical argument that if you really want anything that looks like stimulus now, which will never be called stimulus again, you want to embed it in some long-term deficit thing. That's why you see Obama talking about so much about infrastructure spending, which he clearly hopes to slip into any grand bargain.
Hugh Grindstaff. Ken made a lot of my points, but I think we should stop using the term Obamacare. It's the Affordable Care Act. With Obamacare, what you do is you get a political tinge to it that keeps resonating. And as a WMP, a white male Protestant, I'm finding this kind of interesting because we're not all bad. Some of us are very progressive thinking people who believe that we live in a society that needs a little bit of government, but government should be only there when you really need it. And one of the cuts of sequester for the Army has been the tuition assistance program, where the guys who are active duty, who have joined the military, who want to go to school at night to get their degree and possibly seek a career afterwards, rather than go to the unemployment lines, that's been cut. Is it an example of where it's being cut to make a point? Or is it because General O'Donnell, I don't think would have cut to make a point. But it is an example of where the sequester is not fun, and the politicians have to get off their tush and get things done in a real way.
I wasn't fully honest. I'm a half white male Protestant. The politics around Obamacare are really fascinating, right? I mean, for so long it was seen as an albatross for Obama. And now to watch both Stuart Stevens, the head strategist of the Romney campaign, and Governor Romney say that they think it was a big reason Obama won. I don't know if they're right or not, but it's pretty fascinating.
My guess is that before President Obama's term is over, that he will own the term Obamacare and it will no longer be pejorative. And in fact, he once in a while uses it. So I think it will be, I agree with you, it started as a negative, but I think the Democrats are smart enough to just embrace it and declare it as something good. In the back there?
Stephen Call, Program for Public Consultation. You kind of imply that the public is the problem because they don't like increasing taxes nor cutting spending. But in fact, if you get a representative sample of the public together and you give them the budget and revenue options and so on, they actually cut the deficit quite deeply. You give them the Social Security shortfall problem and a series of scored options, and a large majority solve it in about 10 or 15 minutes. So the public it seems to me, is really, if anything, the source of a problem-solving capability, and it's probably more likely that the rigidity and increasing rigidity that in Congress creates a difficulty to find the kind of common sense, common ground solutions that ordinary people can come to. Do you see, what role do you see for bringing this kind of sensibility into this process?
I think the most important word in that is capability. I don't doubt that the public is plenty smart enough, reasonable enough to have the capability to solve the deficit. I mean, we built this deficit calculator at the Times, which was designed to do precisely that, to show people what the trade-offs were. And to finish it, you had to solve it, right? You didn't just get to leave a big deficit. But I don't think that's the way it plays out politically, because I think that saying that you can get together a representative sample and right and left and giving them enough information and they have the ability to solve it is encouraging, but it's different from the fact that when politicians today come out in favor of specific things that would deal with the long-term deficit, they leave themselves vulnerable to criticism that will damage them politically. Because if you come out for changes, which is to say cuts to Medicare or Social Security, or if you come out for tax increases on most people, your opponents can then paint you as someone who's an enemy of the people, and they can do it quite effectively. And so those same people who can go off in a room and read budget stuff and solve the deficit are also not really willing at this point to be voting for people who are coming up with a budget plan that is internally consistent. And I think that's why the public remains more of an obstacle than a help in solving it.
Over here.
Tom Duesterberg at the Aspen Institute. Returning to healthcare again, you noted the recent improvement in the rate of growth of healthcare spending. One of the problems we've had in the last 20 or 30 years is inflation in healthcare is going faster than the overall inflation rate, and the productivity level is growing more slowly than the rest of the economy, especially the goods-producing sector. Do you have any hope that you can see, first of all, do you think that there's any link between the recent experience in healthcare and productivity statistics? I haven't seen them. Do you have any thoughts about how we might incent, in some way, better productivity in healthcare over the long run? And would it do any good in these discussions we're having?
I mentioned this article I wrote a few years ago about Brent James, who's one of the executives at Intermountain Healthcare, which is a big hospital chain, mostly in Utah, a little bit in Idaho. And that was a fascinating experience because I spent a lot of time actually in a hospital. One of the things and Intermountain's had a lot of success on both quality and cost. And one of the things that I think the people who've really worked on this will tell you is that measuring what you do is just so incredibly important. And there is shockingly little of it in healthcare, or there's shockingly less of it than you would think. And so that we're doing all kinds of things, and we're doing them because they feel like they should work, right? The idea of taking someone who has heart disease and giving them a stent, well, that feels like it should work, right? You're taking a blocked artery and you're opening it. That certainly feels like that should make a big difference. And indeed, for certain subpopulations, it's the difference between life and death. But on average, it seems like we're doing vastly more of that than we should. And part of the reason is we're not actually following up and seeing kind of doesn't make a difference. And so I would hope this is an example where big data can have an effect. I don't know healthcare well enough to have a prediction about whether it will.
So, I mean, but he raises a question both about price and quantity. So your thing has to do with quantity and quality of care, but there's a separate issue about the price of the services. And basically, there's only two ways to reduce the rate of price inflation. Either we control it, and there's people who want to do that, or we try more competition, and there are people who want to do that. And I think we're basically going to be experimenting with both at the same time. I also think that I'm not convinced that anybody measures productivity in healthcare in a meaningful way. It's a lot easier to say that it took 10% fewer man hours to make this car than it does to measure the improvements in healthcare and the time that went into it and stuff like that. And depending on your point, on who you're listening to, some people think actually the productivity in healthcare has increased quite a bit if you factor in the stuff that David mentioned about the quality of life and longevity as part of the output.
Probably the best way to measure productivity in healthcare is not productivity, but things like the rate at which we're curing different diseases.
Thank you. Anders Åslund. I'm a bit surprised to hear very little about the tax code. The Washington Post had a big article the other day arguing that a serious reform of the tax code is really underway now, or seriously discussed. And I would be interested in hearing both of you on this. How likely is it to happen? Thank you.
Meaning you think it's more likely than our discussion is suggesting?
Well, it's a big issue, and the question is how likely it is to happen.
Right. I think that comes back to the question before about how likely it is that we actually get some sort of deal. I mean, this is where we are right now, right? The reason the sequester is in effect is the two parties, as much as they dislike it, can't agree on a replacement, right? Any replacement almost certainly needs to involve changes, cuts to entitlement programs, right? Any cuts to entitlement programs needs to involve tax revenue because there's no way the Democrats agree to Social Security or Medicare cuts without higher taxes as well. And so I could imagine it being possible that we get some sort of revenue neutral tax reform, but I don't think the Democrats are likely to want to spend a lot of time and effort on revenue neutral tax reform. So the question is, can we get some sort of early push on tax reform that doesn't yet answer the question of does it reduce the deficit or is it revenue neutral? And then they're doing some of the work, the kind of work that's described in the great Showdown at Gucci Gulch book about the 1980s tax reform. And then you have coming on top of that, the politics change. We get far enough away from the sequester, and it's possible for that to end up having a revenue number. I don't think it's out of the question. I just still think it's less likely than not.
Right. I think, A, the Post story was way too optimistic. B, I guarantee you that whatever tax increase we get this year or next will be called the Tax Reform Act of 2013 or 2014. It may have no reform in it, but it'll be called that. 3, one thing that definitely has changed, though, and I think the presidential campaign, which I found incredibly frustrating on healthcare, on taxes did shed light, as did Bull Simpson, on the fact that there's a way to get more revenue by broadening the base, eliminating deductions, credits, loopholes, and so forth, without raising rates. So to the extent that there's kind of a shared understanding that maybe there's a way to broaden the base and have fewer tax expenditures, to that extent there's been some movement forward in that thing. But finally, I mean, tax reform in 1986 was partly a miracle, and partly the work of a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who trusted each other. And I don't know if you've noticed lately, but trust does not seem to be a great excess of supply now. And so tax reform has winners and losers, and the losers are always very well organized. And so it's really hard to be optimistic about that given the lack of trust. Maybe one more question, and then we'll call it a day, and David can sign the outside of your Kindles or something.
Gosh, I'm sorry to keep everyone. Jonathan Rausch of Brookings. David, I started covering this, I think, maybe before you did in the early 80s, and the lesson I think I've learned over 30 years is that the Washington pundit class tends to equate a grand bargain with optimism and anything short of that as bad. And I think what I've learned is that grand bargains don't happen in Washington. The way we deal with these is with a series of incremental steps. It's trench warfare. It's TEFRA, 1990 bill, 1993 bill, 1997 bill. We're doing that again. What are the odds we can deal with this incrementally and without having to set ourselves up for a big failure at a grand bargain?
I agree with all that about how grand bargains like 1986 are a lot less common than these other possibilities. We're not that far from that, right? If you could, and I also agree with the premise of your question, which is people should be really careful about saying that the grand bargain is some sort of objective good, right? The grand bargain is like a policy position, and some people like it and some people don't. You could imagine something that cancels the sequester, that doesn't need to be huge, right? Or that tweaks the sequester, since we probably can't cancel it, and that isn't the $4 trillion grand bargain, but instead is something more like $1 trillion. And then you combine that with the spending cuts from 2011, the tax increases on New Year's Eve this year, and you basically look over the last few years and you say, wow, they set out to do a fair amount of deficit reduction, and they've done it, and it's not as arbitrary and unthinking as the sequester was, and it includes various dials on things like Medicare, that if our deficit ends up being less bad, we can turn down, and if it's more bad, we can turn up. So I think that's completely plausible. I think if you extend the time horizon beyond 2014, it may even be the most likely scenario.
I agree with your point that that we do this incrementally, and that's what we've done in the past. I think what grand bargain is a synonym for is doing the hard stuff. So the first thing they did is they set caps on annually appropriated spending that go out for 10 years that have no specifics in them, and they promise to live by them. Then the second thing they do is they raise taxes mostly on rich people. Those are important ingredients. But what has to happen, as David has so eloquently said, is we got to wrestle with the Medicare, Social Security, maybe even Medicaid part of the budget, and we got to wrestle with revenues on people who make less than $250,000 a year. And what you might consider incremental, we have now defined as a grand bargain. With that, thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good cross-section of America.